Now, do we call it the predominant mentality of such an era, or just sheer cruelty and detest for a people not like they are?
Get back in line!
History informs us that between about 1500 and 1900, Europeans forcibly uprooted millions of people from throughout West Africa and West Central Africa and shipped them across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. What could have inspired that level of animosity? To refer to the Africans who were enslaved only as slaves strips them of their identity. They were, for instance, farmers, merchants, priests, soldiers, goldsmiths, and musicians. They were husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. European slavers dispersed them across the Americas to lead lives of degradation and brutality without thought for their personal lives. Millions died in the process. As a result, people of African descent are spread throughout the Americas and Western Europe. This is called the African diaspora. In this video, we are taking a dive into what it feels like to live life aboard a slave ship. You shall be intimated with details on the horrendous events inside what is called a slave ship, on the lives of blacks captured against their will and turned to slaves in the wink of an eye. Hit the thumb button to support our works as we proceed. Share content with as many as you can, and subscribe to stay with us if you are yet to. Your support means a lot to us. Let's take a dive in. Slave ships were large cargo ships specially converted for the purpose of taking slaves, especially newly captured African slaves, to the Americas. Living conditions for slaves on these ships was awful. Men, women, and children were crowded into every possible space, leaving no room to move or even breathe. There was little food, and the smell could not be described. Between 1526 and 1867, about 12.5 million slaves were sent by slave ships from Africa to the Americas. But only about 10.7 million slaves actually arrived, meaning that 1.8 million had died in the Middle Passage. Of all human migrations, this had caused the most human deaths. The average time to sail across the Atlantic was 60 to 90 days. Sometimes the trips took up to 4 months. Traders set out from European ports towards Africa's west coast. There they bought people in exchange for goods and loaded them into the ships. While Europeans owned and operated the slave ships, the work of kidnapping new victims was generally left to West Africans, whom they have successfully lured into the ungodly activity. Bands of slavers would roam the African countryside, preying on villagers who let their guard down. Olaudah Equiano, who was abducted when he was 8 years old, has his own side of the story to tell.
When all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep.
It sometimes took several months to transport captives to the coast, and they were often sold and resold to several new owners along the way. Once they reached the coast, some captives were taken to slave forts or compounds where they waited for a slave vessel to arrive. Many of these fortresses still stand on the coasts of Africa, at places like Elmina and Goree Island, as ruined monuments to the cruel economy of years past. Once a ship was ready, the Africans were handed over to their new captors, Europeans and Americans, who would take them on their journey to the Americas. Ship captains were under orders by slavers to deliver only saleable slaves. Starving, sick, or troublesome slaves were often thrown overboard into the ocean to drown. Sometimes Africans were kept on deck chained together with long chains. There were times when these captives would jump overboard, taking every other chained slave with them to avoid their unknown fate. Many ships kept extra crew members on deck to prevent this from happening. At other times, crew members would throw slaves overboard as a warning to other slaves. If the ship was running out of food or water, all the slaves would be killed to save the crew from starving. Slave ships could at times get insurance on their cargoes of slaves, but insurance would not pay if the slavers starved the slaves or they got sick. Insurance paid out if the slaves drowned, but not if they were severely starved to death. In 1781, the slave ship Zong was hauling 470 slaves, which was more than the ship could handle. Many began to get sick. By the time the ship reached the doldrums, a mid-Atlantic region that at times had no wind, several of the crew had died from the spreading diseases. To save themselves, the remaining crew threw 132 dying and sick slaves into the ocean. Another 10 slaves had also jumped with them. When they tried to collect the insurance underwriter denied the claim, which had led to a court case in 1782, in a court in Jamaica, ruled for the owners. This occurrence would attract a great deal of public attention then. No member of the crew or the owners were ever charged with murder. However, we shall not go into the Zong story proper for now, but certainly another day soon. So back to slave ships.
Bring me the girl I like. Bring her now, Mr. Character.
Olaudah Equiano, yet again, had more to tell us concerning the unimaginable horrors of his encounters. This is how he described his journey in a slave ship.
The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely the room to turn himself, almost had us suffocated. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now becoming insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell, and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable.
Those who were not killed by conditions on board were often permanently disabled by beatings or disease. Many slave captains threw sick or injured Africans overboard so that their losses would be covered by insurance. Though they were shackled, sickened, and outnumbered, captive Africans frequently fought back against their tormentors. On more than 300 voyages, the captives on the slave deck attempted to overthrow the crew, and in several cases they triumphed. In 1839, the victorious Africans on the slave ship Amistad even succeeded in sailing the ship into port and eventually returned home in freedom. About 15 to 20% of the ships leaving Africa never arrived in the Americas. In thousands of cases, the crews were overtaken by captured slaves, some of them warriors. Often the crew was killed, and the Africans managed to sail back to Africa. In other cases, the ships were lost at sea. Interestingly, there are tons of documented slave ship revolts that you really ought to know of. 1. The Little George ship revolt. This one happened after the ship Little George left Guinea in the June of 1730. It was carrying 96 slaves to Rhode Island. Several of the African men slipped out of their shackles and overpowered the crew. They killed 3 of the crew who were on deck at the time. The rest were taken prisoner. The Africans sailed the ship back to the Sierra Leone River, where they had abandoned the ship and still imprisoned the crew. Our number 2 account happened in 1732. A ship out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which was captained by John Major, had just loaded hundreds of slaves and was leaving when about 50 Africans took over the ship. The crew was killed with guns, axes, swords, and other weapons taken from the crew members. A third account happened in 1747, where an American ship with a captain named Beers was taken over by hundreds of captive Africans in West Africa. All but 2 of the crew were killed with their own weapons. There was no record of how many Africans died during the short battle. The list where Africans revolted in a slave ship is endless. In a 1764 ship incident, an unnamed ship from New London, Connecticut had just taken on a load of slaves in Senegal. That night, while the ship was still in port, the Africans freed themselves and, using clubs, killed the entire crew and captain, after which the Africans then disappeared back into Senegal. Another interesting slave ship revolt had also happened in 1839, the Spanish ship Amistad. The slave ship in question was sailing off the coast of Cuba in the process of smuggling slaves. By this time, slave trading was illegal, except in Cuba. Joseph Cinque, who had been captured as a slave in Sierra Leone, led a revolt that had far-reaching consequences. The court case in Connecticut that followed was appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it was upheld. Cinque and the surviving Africans returned to Sierra Leone in 1842. What about the Creole ship uprising of October 27th, the year 1841? This one was bound for New Orleans with a cargo of 135 slaves. The slaves were able to kill some of the crew, and then the rest were taken captive. The ship arrived at Nassau, Bahamas, where the slaves were set free by the British. Documented accounts of slave ship revolt are just countless. Slave ships ranged in size from the 10-ton Hesketh, which could carry a crew plus 30 captive Africans, to the 566-ton Par, which carried a crew of 100 and could hold a cargo of as many as 700 enslaved people. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped off their clothing and remaining possessions, and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, these enslaved Africans would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were separated by gender and age. The lower deck of a slave ship was divided into separate compartments for men and women, with the men shackled together in pairs, and the women left unchained but confined below, and children often free to move about the ship. Enslaved women tended to be outnumbered 2 to 1. Female-male ratios varied according to region, as well as period, argues Jennifer L. Morgan in Laboring Women, Reproduction and Gender in New World Slavery, University of Pennsylvania Press, Philadelphia, 2004. From the evidence on many vessels over time, generally women were doubly victimized and sexually abused. Ships were hypersexualized spaces, crewed by men who might have close relationships only with each other or ship's animals. Male crew typically took women passengers, be they convicts, enslaved women, or unprotected immigrants, as sexual partners for the duration of a trip. Sometimes they even married them. There could be tenderness and gallant protectiveness, but women almost always had the less powerful position. In some cases, women managed to turn men's desire for them, or assumptions of women's inferiority, for their own benefit, even on slave ships. Shipboard practices varied, but on most slave ships, women were usually left unshackled. They had more freedom to rove the ship than did men. Enslaved women were also tragic murder victims, as these 2 stories of voyages show. Dramatic stories of 2 enslaved women on ships reveal something about the realities of the long, cooped-up and traumatic voyages and gendered relations. The unnamed young woman was on Captain John Kimber's recovery from New Calabar. They were headed for Grenada in October 1791. Isaac Cruikshank graphically pictured the terrible situation of the 15-year-old African virgin who refused to exercise. Her refusal was normal. Many did, not least because they were too saddened by their plight to dance, that is, to be complicit in the process of making themselves into commodities that could be sold as healthy and fit on arrival. But in this case, Kimber allegedly flogged her repeatedly. He was said to have several times made the crew suspend her by one leg and then drop her to the deck of the ship. She died. One of the 27 of the 300 slaves died on the 57-day trip. In 1792, Kimber was tried for her murder, but acquitted. William Wilberforce used this Cruikshank image in his struggle to bring the abolition of slavery, 1800. It's an effective image as propaganda, but it also needs discussion. That same year, 1791, Captain James D. Wolfe was indicted for murdering a woman, also unnamed. He had her put overboard because he thought she had smallpox and would infect everyone on board the Polly. Caring? No. He just didn't want to lose his potentially profitable cargo. Captain James D. Wolfe first had the sick woman put high up in the mainmast 2 days earlier. Then he ordered she be put overboard. The sailors refused, according to Seaman John Cranston. Scared to touch her? No, they were actually quite keen to get exposure to smallpox and thereby gain immunity. On their refusal, D. Wolfe himself ran up the shrouds. Then he lashed her in a chair and tied a mask round her eyes and mouth, and there was a tackle hooked upon the slings round the chair when we lowered her down on the larboard side of the vessel. Cranston said the mask was tied onto the woman so that she could not see what was happening to her, so that she would not struggle, and to prevent her making any noise that the other slaves might not hear, lest they should rise. She drowned. they didn't rise. Marcus Rediker writes of the D. Wolfe case in The Slave Ship, A Human History, John Murray, London, 2007.
I started looking at enslaved women's conditions as part of studying their regulation on ships. Convicts and emigrants had white shipboard matrons and conductresses to look after, but also marshal them. They were like wardresses, albeit not very authoritative ones, and could almost be seen as akin to World War I lady patrollers. Enslaved women had no such protectors on their ships.
One of the jobs of gender-aware historians is to examine, where we can, how much men's terrible femophobia played a part in different voyages, and how women negotiated agency where they could. Black and Asian women's struggle was, of course, especially challenging. Matilda McCreer, 1857 to 1940, was the last known living survivor in the United States of the transatlantic slave trade and the ship Clotilda. She was a Yoruba who was captured and brought to Mobile County, Alabama, at the age of 2. McCreer was captured in West Africa with her mother and sisters by the army of the West African Kingdom of Dahomey, which had attacked their home. The Dahomeans transported their prisoners to Ouida, a coastal port for slave trading. They were among more than 100 Africans transported in 1860 on the Clotilda. She had 2 other sisters whose names are not known. The girls were later sold apart from their mother and never reunited. Captain William Foster of the Clotilda, the last known slave ship to have carried captives from Africa to the United States, later arrived in Ouida and transported 110 enslaved Africans, including McCreer, to the United States illegally, as the U.S. prohibited the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 with the Act prohibiting importation of slaves. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, McCreer, who first took the surname of Cree, continued to work as a sharecropper in Alabama with her relatives. She never married, but, according to her grandson, had 14 children with a white German-born man. She changed her name from Cree to McCreer. In her 70s, McCreer made a legal claim for compensation for her enslavement, which was dismissed. In January 1940, McCreer fell ill after a stroke. She died January 13th in Selma, Dallas County, Alabama, aged 83. Prior to the publication of Durkin's research in 2020, McCreer's contemporary Ridoshi, from 1848 to 1937, was thought to be the last living survivor of the Clotilda and of the transatlantic slave trade. In slave ships, there were no sanitary facilities of any kind. The conditions were appalling, with hundreds of people crowded together with little airflow and less sanitation. Captive Africans suffered from diseases such as dysentery and smallpox, depression and outright despair, the cruelty of captain and crew, and sexual exploitation. As a result, mortality rates averaged above 20% for captive Africans in the first decades of the slave trade, and about 10% by 1800. The possibility of mutiny or revolt resulted in a heavy hand with discipline. Crew and captive cargo were routinely whipped, and more extreme forms of violence, including thumbscrews, were used to discipline the Africans. Despite this, Africans did resist. Some committed suicide by jumping overboard or refused to eat, while others organized insurrections. Although due to the overwhelming weaponry brought to bear by the crew, few attempts at revolt succeeded. The voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, generally took 6 to 8 weeks. Once in the Americas, those Africans who had survived the gruesome journey were offloaded for sale and put to work as enslaved labor. The ships then returned to Europe with goods such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and later cotton, which had been produced by enslaved labor. The triangle, involving 3 continents, was then complete. European capital, African labor, and American land and resources combined to supply a European market. The colonists in the Americas also made direct slaving voyages to Africa, which did not follow the triangular route. This trade had increased after 1800, particularly from Brazil. For the captive Africans aboard a slave ship, the voyage to the New World was a passage of unimaginable horror. For most captives, the separation from their villages and families was still fresh, and now they were thrust into a hostile and alien world, at the mercy of people who were like none they had ever seen before. Upon boarding, they were stripped of their belongings, branded, chained, and sent below decks, where they would be forced to remain for most of the months-long journey. Enslaver ships spent several months traveling to different parts of the coast, buying their cargo. The captives were often in poor health from the physical and mental abuse they had suffered. They were taken on board, stripped naked, and examined from head to toe by the captain or surgeon. Conditions on board the ship during the Middle Passage were appalling. The men were packed together below deck and were secured by leg irons. The space was so cramped they were forced to crouch or lie down. Women and children were kept in separate quarters, sometimes on deck, allowing them limited freedom of movement, but this also exposed them to violence and sexual abuse from the crew. The slave deck itself was a living nightmare. To the slave traders, these human beings were cargo, and slave ships were especially designed to transport as many captives as possible, with little regard for either their health or their humanity. Slave decks were often only a few feet high, and the African captives were shackled together, lying down, side by side, head to foot, or even closer. Deaths from suffocation, malnutrition, and disease were routine on the slave deck, as were arbitrary torture and murder by the crew. The closeness, the filth, and the fear delivered many into madness, and suicide attempts were common. Other ships could smell slavers from far away, and Portuguese sailors called them tumbeiros, or floating tombs. The air in the hold was foul and putrid. Seasickness was common, and the heat was oppressive. The lack of sanitation and suffocating conditions meant there was a constant threat of disease. Epidemics of fever, dysentery, the flux, and smallpox were frequent. Captives endured these conditions for about 2 months, sometimes longer. In good weather, the captives were brought on deck in mid-morning and forced to exercise. They were fed twice a day, and those refusing to eat were force-fed. Those who died were thrown overboard. The combination of disease, inadequate food, rebellion, and punishment took a heavy toll on captives and crew alike. Surviving records suggest that until the 1750s, 1 in 5 Africans on board ship died. Some European governments, such as the British and French, introduced laws to control conditions on board. They reduced the numbers of people allowed on board and required a surgeon to be carried. It is important to note that the principal reason for taking such action was because of their concern for the crew, and not even for the suffering captives. The surgeons, though often unqualified, were paid head money to keep captives alive. By about 1800, records show that the number of Africans who died had declined to about 1 in 18. In closing, the horrors endured by black males and females aboard slave ships stand as enduring testaments to the depths of human cruelty and resilience. As we reflect on these atrocities, let us not just remember the suffering, but let it fuel our commitment to justice, equality, and the dignity of every individual. May their stories inspire us to confront and dismantle the legacies of oppression that continue to shape our world today. That brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. And if you did learn a thing or two, then support our works by hitting the thumb button, share with friends and family to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us. We've got more eye-opening contents coming your way. Don't miss out. Thank you for watching.